The emergency beacon had been screaming across space for 3 full cycles now, and still, nobody came to help the honorary people who lived on the meditation worlds, where they had built temples and gardens for 10,000 years every species in the galaxy heard the message because the Galactic Council made sure of it, and the message was simple and terrible. The Vrul swarm had come and they were destroying everything and everyone, and the Anari needed help right now, or they would all die within just a few more days. The Anari were peaceful people who spent their time thinking about philosophy and tending beautiful gardens and creating art that inspired others across the stars, and they had no weapons and no armies because they believed violence solved nothing. But the Vrul swarm did not care about philosophy or beauty or peace because the Vrul were a hive species that existed only to consume and spread and destroy, and they came in numbers that blotted out the stars themselves. With their organic ships that pulsed with horrible alien life, the Galactic Council sent the beacon to everyone who might help, and then they waited for the responses to come in from the mighty empires and confederations that had armies and fleets, and the power to stop the Vrul before it was too late. The Thesid Empire responded first with a message that was polite but firm. They had treaty obligations in another sector and simply could not spare any ships right now, no matter how terrible the situation was, and they wished the Anari, well, the Kalathi Confederacy sent their sympathy next and said they were deeply sorry, but their defense pacts had specific language that excluded conflicts with hive species because such conflicts were too costly and too dangerous. Even the Rakthan, who were usually bold and aggressive with their military, might claim that all their fleets were undergoing essential maintenance at exactly this moment, which everyone knew was a convenient lie. One by one the responses came in, and one by one they were all the same. No help was coming because nobody wanted to fight the Vrul swarm. The council members understood why, even if they would not say it out loud, because fighting the Vrul meant accepting massive casualties and losing ships and soldiers, and the Vrul did not negotiate or retreat or show mercy, and they simply kept coming until either they won or they were completely destroyed. Saving the Anari would cost too much, and so the great empires and confederations decided to let them die. In the council chambers, the representatives sat in uncomfortable silence because they all knew they were abandoning innocent people to a horrible fate, but they also knew their own populations would not accept the losses that saving the Anari would require. The beacon would keep broadcasting for another 12 hours, and then it would go silent forever because the Vrul would have consumed the last of the meditation worlds and wiped out everyone who lived there. Then, with only 11 hours left before the deadline, something unexpected happened that made every council member look up at their displays in surprise. A response had arrived from the humans. The human message was short and direct, without any diplomatic language or polite excuses. Coordinates received and confirmed, it said, and then just 4 more words that changed everything. We are coming now. The council chamber erupted in confused discussion because nobody had expected the humans to respond at all, much less to actually commit to helping. Humans had only joined the Galactic Council 40 standard years ago, which made them newcomers who were still learning how everything worked, and most species kept them at a polite distance. The galaxy knew 3 main things about humans, and none of them seemed particularly relevant to the current crisis. First, everyone knew humans were creative in strange and unpredictable ways, and they made entertainment media that other species found confusing or disturbing. Second, humans were social and friendly, and they seemed genuinely interested in other species and cultures, which was charming, but also slightly odd. Third, and most troubling, humans had a reputation for violence that made other species uncomfortable, because their own history was nothing but war after war after war, going back thousands of years. The humans called themselves a peaceful species now, and they seemed to mean it, but their past was soaked in blood from conflicts over resources and territory and ideology and religion, and sometimes it seemed like they fought just because they enjoyed it. Every species had some violence in their past, but human history was extreme, even by galactic standards, and it made others nervous to have them around. The council had accepted them as members because they followed the rules and contributed to galactic society, but there was always an underlying tension and a quiet agreement to keep them from having too much influence. Now these violent newcomers were volunteering to fight the Vrul swarm when nobody else would. Some council members felt relief because at least someone was responding, and maybe the humans could buy enough time for the Anery to evacuate more people. Others felt concern because if the humans failed badly, it would make the council look even worse for not sending proper help. Few felt something like shame because the so-called civilized species were being shown up by the newcomers everyone secretly feared. The Thesid representative spoke up with worry in his voice. Do the humans understand what they are facing here? He asked the chamber, and the Vrul have destroyed entire battle fleets, and the humans have never fought anything like this before. The Kalathi ambassador added her own concern. Perhaps we should warn them that this is not a small raid or pirate attack, but a full swarm invasion, she said, and they may not realize the scale of what they are volunteering for. But the human ambassador to the council, a calm older woman named Rodriguez, simply smiled and said something that made everyone uncomfortable. We know exactly what we are facing, she told them, and we have read all the reports and tactical analyses, and we understand the Vrul better than you might think. She paused and looked around the chamber at all the species who had found excuses not to help. The difference, she continued, is that we are going anyway, because someone has to, and because it is the right thing to do. The chamber fell silent again, because there was nothing to say to that. Council members went back to their homeworlds and their comfortable positions, and told themselves they had made the practical choice. Meanwhile, the human fleets were already moving toward the meditation worlds at maximum speed, carrying soldiers and pilots who knew they were heading into a battle that might kill them all. But they went anyway because the Anari had asked for help, and nobody else had answered the call. Commander Shkar stood on the bridge of the last orbital station above the fourth meditation world and watched her sensors with 3 of her 4 eyes, while the 4th eye monitored the evacuation shuttle still lifting off from the surface below. The Anari had 4 eyes that could move independently, which was useful in situations like this when everything was happening at once and all of it was bad too. Of the 7 meditation worlds were already gone and consumed completely by the Vrul swarm, which had turned beautiful gardens and ancient temples into nothing but organic waste and scattered debris. The Vrul ships, if anyone could call them ships, looked like massive tumors floating in space, and they pulsed with disgusting life as they moved through the system like a plague, searching for anything to consume. Iskara had seen the recordings from the first world to fall, and she still had nightmares about how the Vrul had systematically destroyed everything her people had built over 10,000 years of careful work. Her tactical officer called out from his station. Commander, the human fleet is emerging from FTL now, he said with surprise in his voice. Ara turned all 4 eyes to the main display and watched as 40 human ships appeared in bursts of distorted space that marked faster than light travel. She had seen human vessels before at diplomatic functions and trade meetings, but those had been civilian ships with smooth lines and welcoming lights. These ships were different in a way that made her scales itch with primitive fear. Human warships were ugly and brutal, looking with none of the elegant curves that proper starship desires preferred, and they were covered in odd protrusions that her computer identified as weapon systems and sensor arrays and launch tubes. They looked like someone had built ships specifically for fighting and nothing else. The formation they took was one her tactical computer labeled as aggressive strike posture, which seemed insane given that the Vrul outnumbered them by hundreds to 1. A communication channel opened, and a human voice came through her translator. Anari command, this is Rear Admiral Chun of the UEN's Indomitable. The voice said calmly like this. Was just another day, and we have brought the cavalry, so please transmit current rule positions and your evacuation status. Shara's translator turned cavalry into mounted warriors, which was an archaic concept from before spaceflight, and it seemed absurdly out of place in a modern space battle. She quickly transmitted all the tactical data she had, including the positions of the Vrul swarm elements and the locations of the remaining evacuation sites and the projected timeline before the Vrul overwhelmed their last defenses. The numbers were grim. Thousands of Vrul organisms against 40 human ships, and maybe 6 hours before the evacuations were complete. Data received and understood, Commander. Admiral Chun replied, and his voice still had that same strange calm to it. And we will keep the Vrul busy, so please focus on getting your people out safely. Shara wanted to tell him that 40 ships could not stop thousands of Vrul, and that he was leading his people to their deaths for nothing, but the human fleet was already accelerating toward the largest Vrul concentration instead of taking up defensive positions around the evacuation sites. They were going on the attack. Her tactical officer made a sound of distress. Commander, they are heading straight for the main swarm, he said, and they will be surrounded and destroyed in minutes. Shkara could only watch as the distance between the human fleet and the Vrul closed with terrible speed. Then the humans opened fire and everything changed. The weapons that lit up the darkness of space were nothing like what the Anari had seen before in their studies of galactic warfare. Kinetic accelerators threw projectiles at speeds that made them deadly as any energy. Weapon and nuclear warheads detonated in carefully calculated patterns, and something her computer called laser arrays cut through Vrul organisms like they were made of paper. The Vrul swarm, which had overwhelmed every defense through sheer numbers and savage determination, suddenly found itself facing an enemy that matched their aggression. Human destroyer disappeared under a wave of Vrul fighters that covered it completely like insects swarming over Fujkara. Thought the ship was lost. But then it exploded in a massive detonation that vaporized the destroyer and 300 Vrul organisms in a sphere of nuclear fire. Her sensors detected escape pods and assault shuttles that had launched just seconds before the detonation, and those small craft were already attacking another Vrul capital organism, while the crew inside them sang battle songs. Her tactical officer was staring at the display in horror. They destroyed their own ship, he whispered, and they killed themselves to take the enemy with them. But Shkar was watching the life signs in those escape pods and shuttles. No, she said quietly, and they evacuated first and then used their ship as a weapon, which was somehow even more disturbing because it meant they had planned this. The battle continued with an intensity that made her previous understanding of warfare seem quaint, and outdated human carriers launched wave after wave of small fighters that attacked in coordinated groups, and when the Vrul tried to swarm them, the fighters led them into kill zones where the larger ships were waiting missiles with independent guidance systems hunted Vrul organisms through the debris fields, and when regular weapons were not enough, the humans used nuclear warheads without hesitation. A Vrul bioplasma weapon hit a human carrier and destroyed its FTL drive, which should have forced it to retreat. Instead, the carrier reconfigured itself as a stationary firebase and kept launching fighters while its defensive weapons created a protective umbrella over the Anari evacuation transports. The Usti human pilots were singing, and Char's communication officer had picked up their broadcasts by accident. They were singing old human songs about warriors and battles and sacrifice, and they sang while throwing themselves impossible odds. Her tactical officer spoke again, and his voice was shaking. Commander, they fight like the Vrul do, he said, and they are just as savage and willing to die. Shkara watched a human cruiser ram a Vrul capital organism after its main weapons were destroyed, and the explosion took out both ships, plus a dozen smaller Vrul fighters. No, she said, and all four of her eyes were fixed on the tactical display and the rule. Fight like animals driven by instinct, she continued, and the humans fight like something that has spent its entire existence learning how to kill efficiently. By the end of the first day, the rule had lost 30% of their swarm, which was unheard of because the rule never lost that badly. The humans had lost 18 ships and 7,000 crew members, and then they called for reinforcements. 3 more human fleets arrived over the next week, and each one fought with the same terrible competence. The rule began to retreat for the first time in recorded history, because they had finally met something more ferocious than themselves. The battle for the meditation worlds lasted 14 standard days, and by the end of it, the rule swarm had been driven completely from the system for the first time anyone could remember. Commander Shkara watched the last rule organisms flee into FTL space and felt something she had not expected to feel again. Hope for her people's survival. 4 of the 7 meditation worlds had been saved, along with most of their temples and gardens, and nearly 80% of the Inari population had been evacuated safely. The cost had been terrible, though. 11,000 humans had died in the fighting, and another 3,000 were wounded badly enough that they would never fully recover. 26 human ships had been destroyed completely, and another 15 were so damaged they would need to be scrapped. Skara had never seen such casualties in her lifetime, because the Anari were peaceful, and the galaxy's other conflicts were usually small border disputes or trade disagreements. But the humans acted like this was normal and expected. Admiral Chun had read every single name of the dead personally in a ceremony that lasted 6 hours, and Jagara had watched the recording with all 4 eyes because she felt she owed them that much now. She stood in the shuttle bay of the UEN's Indomitable, waiting to meet the Admiral in person and thank him for what his people had done. The Indomitable was a massive carrier that showed the scars of battle across its hull, with burn marks and patched holes and entire sections that were exposed to space and sealed with emergency force fields. Human crew members moved through the corridors with quiet efficiency, and many of them had visible injuries, but they kept working anyway. The Admiral arrived exactly on time, which Shara had learned was important to human culture, and he was smaller than she expected, with graying hair and tired eyes. Commander Shara, Chun said, and offered his hand in the human greeting gesture, and it is good to meet you in person finally. She took his hand carefully because Inari had more strength than they appeared to have, and she did not want to hurt him. Admiral Chun, she replied, and thank you does not seem like enough for what you have done for my people. Chun smiled, but it was a sad expression. You are welcome, Commander, he said, and I am glad we could help. They walked through the ship together toward the Admiral's office, and Shara noticed how the crew members they passed looked at their Admiral with respect and something else she could not quite identify in the office. Chun offered her a seat and something to drink, which she politely declined because Inari biology did not handle most human beverages well. Admiral, I must ask you something, Shkara said, and she focused all 4 eyes on him, which was a sign of serious intent in her culture. And why did your people come when everyone else refused? Chun was quiet for a long moment, and he looked out the viewport at the stars beyond. Commander, did you know that before we reached the stars, humans had over 200 different nations on our homeworld? He asked. I had heard your species was fragmented before unification. Shkara replied carefully. We fought each other for our entire history. Chun continued, and his voice was distant, like he was remembering something painful. And wars over resources and territory and ideology and religion, and sometimes just because we did not like each other very much. He turned back to look at her. We got very, very good at killing other humans, he said, and we developed weapons that could destroy entire cities. And we used them, and we created strategies and tactics that maximize casualties, and we studied war like other species study art. Shara felt uncomfortable because this confirmed what everyone in the galaxy whispered about humans. But Chun continued, and his expression changed to something more complex, and we also developed philosophies and ethics and codes of honor that came directly from all that violence, and most of us eventually agreed on certain principles. What principles? Shkara asked. That if you have the power to help someone and you choose not to, then you bear some responsibility for what happens to them, Chun said. And that strength without the willingness to use it for good is meaningless, and that standing by while innocents suffer is itself a form of evil. He leaned forward in his chair. We learned these lessons the hard way, Commander, he continued. And we learned them by failing to follow them and watching the consequences, and by seeing what happens when good people do nothing. Shara thought about this and about the species in the galaxy who had refused to help her people. A curious morality for such skilled warriors, she said. Chun laughed, but there was no humor in it. We are not warriors, Commander, he said firmly, and we are teachers and farmers and artists and engineers who learn to fight. Because we had to, and we are parents who want our children to grow up in a better galaxy than we inherited. He stood and walked to the viewport again. We are philosophers who happen to know how to operate weapon systems, he continued, and we are poets who understand tactics, and we are dreamers who can plan military campaigns. The galaxy calls us ferocious, Chun said, and they are afraid of us, and maybe they are right to be afraid, because we are very good at violence when we need to be. He turned back to face her. But we would rather be feared and reliable than safe and useless, he finished, and we would rather have the galaxy nervous about our presence than watch good people die because nobody had the courage to help them. Shkara understood then that humans were more complicated than the simple categories the galaxy tried to put them in. They were not just violent primitives who had stumbled into space, and they were not just peaceful idealists who talked about cooperation. They were something else entirely. They were people who had looked at their own capacity for terrible violence and chosen to point it at things that deserved it. Your people paid a terrible price to save mine, Shkara said quietly. Yes, we did, Chun agreed, and 7,000 families are grieving right now, and that weighs on me every single day. Then why, she asked, and why accept such losses for strangers? Chun smiled again, and this time it was genuine. Because, Commander, if we only helped people we knew then, we would never make new friends, he said. And because the Anari are not strangers anymore after this. He gestured to the damaged ship around them. These ships can be repaired, and new ones can be built. He said that if we had let your people die, we could never repair that failure, and we could never build back the trust that the galaxy needs to survive. Shkara felt tears forming in her eyes, which was unusual for Anari. The galaxy does not deserve you, she said. Maybe not, Chun replied, but they are stuck with us anyway, and we are going to keep answering calls for help, whether they like it or not. He extended his hand again. We should get you back to your people, Commander, he said, and they need you more than I do right now. She took his hand and held it firmly. When the council meets to discuss this, she said, and I will make sure they understand what you did here. I appreciate that, Chun said, but we did not do this for recognition or rewards, and we did it because it needed to be done. Shkara left the Indomitable and returned to her own ship. She thought about what it meant that the galaxy's most feared species was also becoming its most trusted, and she wondered what would happen when the rest of the galaxy realized they needed the ferocious humans more than they wanted to admit. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session 3 weeks after the Battle of the Meditation Worlds, and the chamber was more crowded than usual because everyone wanted to see what would happen next. The official topic was human military actions in council space, but everyone knew what this was really about. The galaxy's powerful species were uncomfortable that the newcomer humans had succeeded. where they had all refused to even try. Ambassador Rodriguez sat in the human delegation section and watched the other species argue among themselves. Before the formal session began, she had been warned this would happen, and that some council members would try to punish humanity for showing them up. The Thesid representative stood first when the session was called to order, and his scales were flushed with the purple color that indicated agitation in his species. The human response to the Inari crisis was excessive and dangerous. He declared to the assembled council, and they used weapons that most civilized species have banned, including nuclear devices and kinetic impactors, and they showed a disregard for their own lives that borders on insanity. Murmurs of agreement came from several other delegations. Furthermore, the Thesid continued, and their tactics were brutal, and their willingness to sacrifice their own ships demonstrates a lack of proper military discipline, and we cannot allow such reckless behavior to become normalized in council operations. The Kalathi ambassador stood next, and her tentacles moved in patterns that her translator rendered as concern. While we appreciate that the humans helped the Inari, she said, and we must question whether such violent methods were truly necessary and whether a more measured approach might have achieved the same results with fewer casualties. Rodriguez felt anger building in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral because losing her temper now would only prove their point. The debate continued for another hour, with various species arguing that humanity had been too aggressive, or too willing to die, or too quick to use devastating weapons. Some claimed the humans had only made the rule angrier, and that there would be retaliation. Others suggested that human tactics would inspire other species to develop similar weapons, which would destabilize the galactic peace. Few even implied that the humans had ulterior motives and were trying to gain influence by making themselves seem indispensable. Rodriguez noticed that none of the speakers mentioned the 7,000 humans who had died, or the Inari who had been saved, or the fact that everyone else had refused to help. Finally, Commander Shikara rose to speak, and the chamber fell silent because the Inari had the moral authority that came from being the victims who had been saved. I have listened to these arguments with all four of my eyes, Shikara said, and her voice was calm but firm, and I find them disturbing for what they reveal about this council. She looked around the chamber. The humans used excessive force, you say, she continued, but what force would have been sufficient against an enemy that numbered in the thousands and showed no mercy? The humans were too willing to die, you claim, she went on, but they evacuated their crews before destroying their ships, and they accepted losses to protect my people when none of you would risk even a single vessel. Her voice grew stronger. You question their tactics and their weapons and their methods, she said, but you do not question your own refusal to help, and you do not explain what you would have done differently if you had actually bothered to show up. The chamber was completely silent now. Humanity did what none of you would do, Shikara declared, and they bled for people they had never met, and they defended places they had never seen, and they asked for nothing in return except that we evacuate safely. She focused her four eyes on the Thesid representative. If that is ferocity, she said, and then I pray to see more of it in this galaxy, because the alternative is a council that speaks of civilization while allowing civilized people to die. Shara sat down, and the Tempes. Silence continued for several long moments. Then, the Rakthan ambassador stood, and his species rarely spoke in council sessions. The Inari representative speaks truth that shames us, he said in his rumbling voice, and my people claimed our fleets were under maintenance when the call for help came, and this was a lie meant to avoid our duty. He looked directly at Rodriguez. The humans have shown us what courage looks like, he continued, and they have demonstrated that being civilized means being willing to fight for civilization when it is threatened. Several other ambassadors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The vote on whether to censure humanity for excessive use of force failed by a wide margin with only the Thesid and Kalathi delegation supporting it. But something else happened in the aftermath of the debate that the humans themselves had not anticipated over. The following months, calls for help began coming to human diplomatic channels instead of going through the normal council procedures. A frontier colony facing pirate raids asked if human patrol ships could assist a trade convoy, requested human escorts through a dangerous sector. A mining station that had lost contact with its parent company wanted human search and rescue teams. Each time the human response was the same. They checked if the council had been notified, and if anyone else was responding, and if the answer was no. Then they went. Ambassador Rodriguez tried to explain the situation at a council meeting 6 months after the Battle of the Meditation Worlds. "We do not want to be your warriors," she said, "and we do not want to be the galaxy's mercenaries or your hired guns for every problem. We want to be partners and friends, and equals in building a peaceful and prosperous galactic community," she continued. The Thesid representative who had opposed them before spoke up. "Then perhaps you should stop answering every distress call that comes your way," he suggested. "And you are setting expectations that cannot be sustained." Rodriguez looked genuinely pained by the suggestion. "We cannot do that," she said. "It is not in our nature to ignore people who need help, even when those people would not do the same." "For you?" The Thesid Asurius smiled, but it was a tired expression. "Especially then," she replied, "and because someone has to be the kind of person who helps regardless of whether it will be reciprocated, and someone has to be willing to answer the call when it comes. If not us, then who?" she asked, and the chamber had no answer. The human delegation left the session, and Rodriguez felt the weight of what her species had become in galactic politics. They had wanted to be explorers and traders and cultural ambassadors. Instead, they had become the ones everyone called when things got dangerous. Her aide walked beside her. "Ambassador, do you think we made a mistake?" he asked. "And by helping the Anari, I mean, and by continuing to respond to these requests." Rodriguez thought about Admiral Chun reading the names of the dead, and about Commander Shara's gratitude, and about all the people who were alive because humans had answered when nobody else would. "No," she said finally. "And we did the right thing, and we will keep doing the right thing, even if it is not what we wanted our role to be. The galaxy will learn to rely on us," her aide said with concern. "Yes, they will," Rodriguez agreed, and that is both a burden and an opportunity, because if they rely on us, then they have to listen to us, and maybe eventually they will learn from us. She looked out at the stars beyond the council station. "Maybe someday they will learn that being strong enough to help means you have a duty to help," she said, and maybe they will start answering the calls themselves. "And if they do not learn?" her aide asked. Rodriguez smiled again. "Then we will keep answering," she said. "And because that is what humans do." Back on Earth, the news reports showed footage of another human fleet deploying to another crisis, and the cycle continued because the ferocious humans could not stop themselves from helping, even when it cost them dearly. 5 years had passed since the Battle of the Meditation Worlds, and the galaxy had changed in ways both obvious and subtle. Commander Shara now held the title of Council Representative for the Honorary people, and she spent her days in diplomatic chambers instead of on orbital stations. She had aged in those 5 years as her species measured such things, and her scales had taken on the silver tint that came with experience and wisdom today. She was visiting a human university on Earth to give a lecture about galactic cooperation, and the auditorium was filled with young human students who had not yet been born when the battle took place. After her formal remarks, a student raised her hand with a question. "Representative Shara," the young woman asked, "and why do you think humans are so different from other species in the galaxy?" It was a question Shara had been asked many times, and she still did not have a perfect answer. "That is complicated," she began, "and I believe It comes from your species' unique history. She moved to the large display behind her and brought up images of human history. You spent thousands of years learning to survive each other, she explained, and every horror that other species fear. You have already faced within your own civilization. The students watched quietly as images of human wars and conflicts played across the screen. You developed weapons that could destroy cities, and you used them against yourselves, Shkara continued. And you created philosophies of hate, and you also created philosophies of love and compassion. And you struggled between these two paths for your entire history. She changed the image to show human art and literature and music, but somehow instead of being destroyed by your capacity for violence, she said. And you learned to channel it and control it and point it at things that deserved it. Ability or capacity for violence, she said. And you learned to channel it and control it and point it at things that deserved it. Young man in the front row raised his hand. But does that make us better than other species? He asked with genuine curiosity. No, Shkara said firmly, and it makes you different, and that difference is both a strength and a burden. She thought about how to explain what she had learned. Other species achieve peace by avoiding conflict, she said, but humans achieve peace by mastering conflict and choosing when to use it. You learned that strength without compassion is tyranny, she continued, and you learned that compassion without strength is meaningless because it cannot protect what it loves. The original student spoke up again. So are we really as ferocious as the other species say we are? Shkara allowed herself a small smile. Oh yes, she replied, and all four of her eyes focused on the students, but you are ferocious in ways they do not understand. You are ferociously kind when you choose to be, she explained, and you are ferociously loyal to your allies, and you are ferociously determined to help even when it costs you everything. She paused to let that sink in. The galaxy feared you because you could fight, she said, and now the galaxy needs you precisely because you choose when not to fight. Another student asked the question Shkara had been waiting for. Representative, what if we had not answered the call, the student said. And what if we had been like everyone else and refused to help? Shara's expression darkened at the memory of watching the rule descend on defenseless monasteries and gardens. Then the meditation. Worlds would be ruins, she said quietly, and my people would be extinct, and the galaxy would have learned that civilization means nothing if nobody is willing to defend it. She looked around the auditorium at all the young faces. You are fortunate that your parents and grandparents were the ones who answered, she told them, and because it taught the galaxy an important lesson. What lesson? Several students asked at once. That sometimes the monsters we fear are the heroes we need. Shara replied, and that true civilization requires the courage to act when action is needed. After the lecture ended, Shkara walked through the university campus with her human guide, and they talked about the changes in galactic politics. Do you think the other species have learned anything? Her guide asked, or are they still expecting us to do all the dangerous work? Shara considered the question carefully. Some have learned, she said, and the Rakthan have started responding to distress calls in their sector, and the Anari have begun training defensive forces for the first time in our history. But many still prefer to let humans take the risks, she admitted, and they have become comfortable with your protection. They reached a memorial that had been built for those who died at the meditation worlds, and GR stood silently before the wall of names. 7,000 names carved in stone. I come here every time I visit Earth, she said quietly, and to remember what your people gave for mine. Her guide, a young diplomatic officer, stood beside her. They knew the risks, he said, and they went anyway. That is what makes it meaningful, Shkara replied. And sacrifice without choice is just death, but sacrifice chosen freely is something else entirely. She reached out and touched one of the names. "This person," she said, and Lieutenant Sarah Chun, who flew a fighter until her fuel was gone and then rammed a rule capital ship to save an evacuation transport. She was 23 years old, Shara continued, and she had her whole life ahead of her, and she gave it up for people she had never met. The guide was quiet for a moment. "My aunt," he said, "and my mother's sister." Shara turned all four eyes to him. "I am sorry," she said. "Do not be," he replied. And she did exactly what she wanted to do, and she saved 2,000 Anari with that one action. They stood together in silence before the memorial. "Representative," the guide finally asked, "and do you think we will ever stop being the ones everyone calls?" Shkara thought about the question. "I hope so," she said, "and I hope the galaxy learns to answer its own calls and to protect its own people. But," she continued, "and I suspect humans will always be the first to respond because it is in your nature, and changing that would mean becoming something you are not." She looked up at the sky where stars were beginning to appear in the evening. "The galaxy still does not fully understand you," she said, "and they see your strength and your weapons and your willingness to fight, and they think they know what you are, but they miss the important part," she continued, "and which is that you fight because you care and you risk your lives, because you believe in something bigger than yourselves." The guide smiled. "We are not perfect," he said, "and we still have our own problems and conflicts." "Nobody is perfect," Shkara agreed. But you are exactly what the galaxy needs, even if the galaxy does not always appreciate it." Years later, when Shira was teaching young Anari students about galactic history, one of them asked her the same question the human student had asked. "Are humans truly ferocious?" the young Anari wanted to know. Shkara thought about Admiral Chun and the singing pilots and the ships that turn themselves into weapons to protect strangers. "Yes," she told her student, "and they are ferocious in the best possible way. They are ferocious defenders of the innocent," she explained, "and they are ferocious believers in doing what is right, and they are ferociously committed to helping others even when it hurts them." The student looked confused. "But is that not just being good?" they asked. "Being good is easy when it costs nothing," Shara replied, "and being ferociously good means being good, even when it costs everything." She pulled up images of the human fleet at the meditation worlds. "These people came when nobody else would," she said. "And they fought when nobody else dared, and they died protecting people they had never met. That is not just being good," she continued, "and that is being the kind of good that changes the galaxy." The student thought about this. "Will they always answer when we call?" The Skejkara smiled with all four eyes. "I believe they will," she said, "and because being human means caring, even when it would be easier not to. And it means helping, even when nobody helps you back. We are fortunate," she finished, "and that the ferocious humans were the only ones who answered, because it showed the galaxy what we could be if we tried." And somewhere in space, another human fleet was responding to another distress call, because some things never changed, and the ferocious humans could not stop themselves from helping. It was simply who they were.